on that road, and all the soldiers and units that we spoke to basically said that the only threat, the main threat that faces them are these things now. I was in Kherson in 2023, a few months after it was liberated, and artillery was the sound in the streets.
I remember.
And when I went again, artillery was much less frequent, and the threat was these things from the sky. It was completely different. It was a different city. The threat was completely different, and there was no hiding from it.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of On the Edge. This week we'll be primarily talking about these things, something that is changing the face of warfare: drones. Our guest is Irish journalist Caolan Robertson, who has been coming here for quite some time and unfortunately, tragically, troublingly, was under attack, hunted down like some sort of human safari in Kherson by something very similar to this, only the Russian version. Since then, he has become focused, not exclusively, but primarily on how these are developing, the thought behind them, how they are being produced, how they're being improved or adapted, and of course the tactics of the use of drones in warfare. And he has been filming all of it for documentaries that he has put out and will be putting out, and has traveled the width and breadth of the front lines to meet with those people who are actually putting this technology to use. But today he's here in Kiev, and we had a chance to sit down and talk about all of this and so much more face to face. So, Caolan, thank you so much for coming and joining us here in the studio today. You've brought with you a couple of drones, and we're going to talk about drones because I know that's a focal point of yours. But before we do, let's get a little bit of your biography. What brought you to Ukraine? And why did you decide to kind of move here full time?
Well, I ran Byline TV for a number of years. This is a liberal media outlet in the UK. I covered Brexit. We covered the corruption that happened with the PPE scandal with Boris Johnson, and I started getting really excited about investigative journalism. This is what Byline was great at its core at, and that's why they hired John Sweeney when the war broke out in 2022. John Sweeney,
who's a friend of the show, has been on before. You know, John and I go way back.
Yeah. And he moved straight to Kyiv. He was here during the full-scale invasion when the city was almost surrounded. And I remember that I really, really wanted to come to Ukraine. Before setting up Byline, had been working with right-wing media. I'd worked with places like Fox.
We better probably clear the air a little bit with that because you had prior worked for some people who were, I'm sorry, well dodgy.
Yeah. So 8 years ago, for 6 months, I worked with Rebel Media. They hired me as my first job presenting. And I knew basically how the far-right ecosystem works, how disinformation works. And what Putin is doing right now is trying to cover up his crimes that are being committed in this country by the Russians. It is peak disinformation. They did this with Brexit, and now they're doing it with Ukraine. And so I felt compelled, understanding how that system works, to come here and expose the war crimes that he's committing.
You saw the light.
Well, I saw the light many years ago when I was like, this would have been like 7 years ago.
Hey, look, I worked inside Fox News for many years, and you know, you gotta put food on the table and a roof over your head.
So none of it was ever for money, ever. I believed everything that I put out when I was doing this back
at the
then.
time.
At the time, I remember when the Orlando shooting happened, 50 gay people killed in a nightclub by an Islamist, and I came out when I was 12 years old as gay, and I remember fearing Islam and not really finding any solutions online, any answers as to why that shooter killed those people in that club. This was America's worst mass shooting at the time. And I typed into YouTube, the Orlando shooting, the top rated results were from Rebel Media. They were from Milo Yiannopoulos and Gavin McInnes standing outside the scene of the crime saying, "This is Islam." They were holding the Quran. They said, "This is the book that incited this massacre." and you should listen to us. Trump held up the gay flag a week later and said, I will protect the LGBT community from this hateful ideology. And Hillary didn't say much. And the media didn't do a very good job discussing the ideology. In actually 2 or 3 years later, once I'd left all this, when the Christchurch shooting happened, 50 Muslims killed by a far-right extremist, we discussed extensively the ideology behind that, but not when it was Islam. And I thought that was, it was almost like a void in the media.
Yeah.
And I understand why they did it. You know, it's Islam is still relatively new in Europe. As European people who make, you know, news, we don't really understand it to an extent. And it's a new thing that's happening. So I understand why that happened. But I went online for answers, and the answers I got were right wing. And they were trying to get gay people to be embraced by them. And that's kind of what started that process. But it's about disinformation, which again is why I always focus and center my content on disinformation about how Putin is pretending that Russia is some Christian-based nation when it's absolutely degenerate and the opposite. And I can kind of understand how it works, and also understand how Russian influence works in right-wing networks, because there was loads of it. It was very obvious. You know, the Russian embassy.
Well, once you start to see it, you can't not see it.
Yeah,
it's insidious. It's everywhere, and I feel you, because working inside Fox, I was constantly trying to get stories about Putin or Russia on the air, and it was always an uphill battle, because they were more interested in the insidious brown people who were either coming to take your jobs or rape your women. I mean, that was unless it had something to do with this invasion, quote unquote, in their words, of foreigners into Europe. It was a very tough sell to talk about anything else. And it's famously General Breedlove, Philip Breedlove, who at one point was Supreme Allied Commander of Europe for NATO. I remember him distinctly putting out a thing in like 2015 saying the Russians are weaponizing immigration and disinformation, and they're using these things in conjunction. So I get it. I understand. But you've come here. Yeah. And decided you're living here permanently. You're putting stuff up, constantly on your channel. We've got your kind of channel. Let's see if we can hear a little bit of this. I don't know if the sound is going to come through, but this is kind of your introduction video. You're up there on Mikhailovsky Square talking about why it is that you've decided to do it. How you got that shot, I'll never know. But there you are amongst the wreckage of Russian tanks and stuff.
Out here, intimidation doesn't shut people up, it makes them louder. And that's why I'm going to commit to make more reports from the front lines in this country to show the world what your leader is doing to people here every single day.
You're putting out stuff. You put out you spent some time with John Sweeney. You put out a movie with him where you guys exposed like white phosphorus, use of white phosphorus and things like that. Mm-hmm. But your real event that a lot of people took to, and it was very evocative. Was these kind of things. Oh, and we got an ad here, but we'll get through it in a moment. Mm-hmm. And it was an incident when you were down. Now we have spoken about Kherson in the past. Yeah. Zornina Zabriskie, who we also have in common, brought it to my attention months and months ago. But for those who don't know, check out, I think it's episode 17 of the show, where we talk about what is called the human safari in Kherson. You then went down there and were a victim of the human safari. And I'll see if I can grab a moment. There it is. Yeah. Yeah, there's you talking to an American aid worker down there. Mm-hmm. But then you're out and about on the streets of Kherson, and this happens to you.
This was very dramatic.
Yeah. So you hear a drone over your head, and you start running from it.
I hear a drone over my head. I also see someone in the top window of one of the apartments, shouting and pointing up at the sky and pointing down at me, but they were shouting in Ukrainian. I didn't understand what they were saying. And then that's when I heard it. And they were obviously warning me to not like be standing in the street. I was the only person standing in this street, and I'd just been on the phone to a friend. And what ended up transpiring was it seemed like being on a British phone number / American phone number that can be intercepted. That was a very, very, very likely scenario. Or they were just hunting civilians like they do every day. And the intel that Zarina and I gathered when we were in Kherson looked like the drones basically fly to a target that they want to hit. A police station, an aid, HQ, a fire truck. And if they don't hit their targets on the way back while the battery of that drone is dying because you can't reuse the drone and you can't, land it back where it took off, they'll get a bonus for just hitting a civilian, like $30, $50, whatever it is. And this is 350 times a day. This happened within 24 hours of me arriving, which is unbelievable. I was completely unprepared.
Notably, it happened, summer or spring, because you can see all the trees on the leaves on the tree there.
Yeah.
But currently we're in winter, fall and winter. And so there is no foliage cover for these people. So why this is not front page news. This is a war crime. There is no doubt about it. These guys hunt human beings. Now, there's also, I've spoken to Zarina about this, and maybe you can back it up, there's also a concept that in some ways this is almost like training for them.
There's been evidence on Russian Telegram channels that they have been deploying Russian soldiers in Zaporizhia and in Kherson to practice on civilians, FPV pilots, before they go to the east.
Right.
It is a sickness that is indescribable, but also sums up what Russia is.
Yeah.
Deeply, deeply demonic, evil. And
cynical, nihilistic.
And they post these videos on Telegram with happy music, laughing about it, because that's what, in a lot of ways, Russian culture is. It's celebrating mayhem. It's celebrating destruction.
Well, it's brutality is what it is. They have a mentality that if you're at war and you have an enemy, that say the rules of war are very very naive and kind of hypocritical. They have this mentality of like, oh, you foolish Westerners with your rules. When you go to war, you go to war.
Yeah.
Let's slip the dogs of war and no restrictions. And it also kind of brings out their nascent cruelty, because they do get abused by their state relentlessly throughout their lives. So it allows them to all that ugliness. The redemption comes out. Now, you also had another famous incident here, and is this the drone?
This is it.
From the incident? So you're traveling up and down the lines.
So this drone, we were on the road to Kharkov about 3 weeks ago, which is the road we were on is now taken by the Russians. This is between Pokrovsk and Kharkov, and this crashed into a vehicle a couple of cars ahead of us. Unfortunately, didn't go off. It had a munition strapped to the bottom of it here. It's been obviously disarmed. You can see the propeller is bent. But I collected it because I wanted to show what it looks like. I wanted to kind of investigate the difference between this and Ukrainian drones. But on that road, and all the soldiers and units that we spoke to basically said that the only threat, the main threat that faces them are these things now. Artillery within the last 6 months has almost become redundant. And the units we were speaking to were desperate for jammers. Jammers are the things that will save your life now. Not helmets, not bulletproof vests, not anything other than jammers, because it has become a war of technology. It's become a war of frequencies. I think about 6 months ago, it was between 300 and 1,000. Now Russians have started to bring their frequencies down to like 200, 100, which Ukrainians didn't even think was possible to jam. And now they're rejigging all their systems. But it's basically all technology, all warfare. And now AI is going to start coming into it, and it's crazy, because I was in Kherson in 2023, a few months after it was liberated, and artillery was the sound in the streets.
I remember.
And when I went again, artillery was much less frequent, and the threat was these things from the sky. It was completely different. It was a different city. The threat was completely different, and there was no hiding from it. And I think
the psychological effect of always knowing that something out of the sky is going to come and chase you down. I mean, they literally chase you down streets. They'll chase. There are even reports of them chasing people into their buildings because these things are so maneuverable.
You can crash
fly
this drone into an apartment, blow a hole in the window, and then send another drone inside into your bed.
into somebody's apartment where they, it's the psychological effect of this is terrible. Of course, it's not just on the front lines as well. I mean, they're larger drones, obviously, like Shaheeds and things that they've gotten from the Iranians, but this constant drone threat is terrifying for all of us.
Psychologically terrifying. Well, you see these videos of guys in trenches, and you can hear that high-pitched buzzing sound. It almost sounds like like a Spitfire.
Yeah.
Which is always bringing back the old sounds of the First and Second World War back to the trenches. But there's nothing like hearing a drone above you, knowing that someone's looking at you, knowing that they can kill you, and you can't see them. You can't see them at the other side of the river. Psychologically, it's probably the most insane thing I will ever experience.
Yeah, and this isn't exactly new technology. I saw drones in Iraq and Afghanistan. I remember speaking to Pakistanis who were in the frontier when America was using drones against them. And there's something about a machine that cannot be killed, will not have repercussions if you are killed. You're not taking a soldier off the line. There's no body bag that's going back. But there's this threat, this almost like omnipresent threat. So and now that was back in the day. These things have changed everything because you can churn out. I mean, I saw the latest. Now this is a Ukrainian drone, and the latest stat that I saw out of the Ministry of Defense, I think it was that said, or maybe it was Armed Forces Command, that they've churned out 200,000 of these in this month of December, 2024 alone, and that. If you look at last December, where I think they churned out 80, shows you how important this is.
It's priced. That costs $300. This drone is about $300. Ukrainian made, of course. And as you can see, there's a nice detail of 3D printed fingerprints at the end here.
Yeah.
The last thing you see. It's not just changing the war here, it's changing the future of warfare. Other countries are looking at this and they're thinking, okay, we don't need $100 million weaponry systems. We don't need $10 million old school drones. We need $1,200,000 cost each drones, and we can take over our neighbors, and we can, we can have an army basically.
Yeah.
And that is where we're really going to start seeing changes. The fall of Assad was connected to these drones.
Yes,
we saw FPV videos that the rebels were using on the outskirts of the city.
And I don't know if it's been confirmed anywhere, but notably, there's a lot of talk that Ukrainian drone operators were in Syria at the time. So look, had that hit and exploded, whatever munition was on it, what's the capability of these things? What's the range? Mm-hmm. What's the ability to the capacity of a thing like that to damage, whether it's an individual, a car, or an armored piece of military equipment? What are those? Those are my two main questions about physically what these things are capable of doing.
So this is a standard FPV drone. It can fly probably up to about 10 kilometers, and it can carry a payload up to
about 8 miles.
Yeah, about between 3 and 5 kilograms. That's a shell that looks about the size of this mug.
Right.
Not that big, not that heavy, but very, very effective. Would take out a car. Would probably mess with a tank. Would make it difficult to continue driving that tank. And most of the FPV videos that you see on your newsfeed on X are filmed with basically this model. Mm-hmm. They crash and then the screen goes blurry. But there are multiple systems that can carry much bigger weights. In the documentary I've just shot, when we were in Sumy on the border to Kursk, we were filming with a drone that had 8 propellers. It was called a vampire drone because it flies at night. It's thermal. That can carry up to 20 kilograms. We were using that to drop anti-tank mines onto a field. That were World War II anti-tank mines.
Yeah.
And which is very interesting. But that could also carry a 20 kilogram bomb, which could take out a lot, could take out a convoy, could do serious damage to a building, concrete busting level stuff. And then you have other systems where you can have drones with fixed wingspans that can carry up to 6 of these and drop them remotely. They're called mother drones, and I've seen that used as well. There was actually a place in north of Kyiv I was in a week ago that could drop 3 just from the center of it. But what that does is it also lets you double the range of these drones, because the mother drone can hover right above and act as an antenna. So then you can fly these things 20 kilometers.
Right. And the signal gets bounced back to the operator.
Exactly. So that's really interesting. And that's kind of where things are going in a lot of ways. We've already started seeing videos in the last couple of weeks of these being dropped from wings.
Well, and what I find also really interesting about drone and drone technologies, we'll talk about tactics in a moment, but before we do, I've also seen, interestingly enough, these are not just so obviously they carry ammunition, and in some ways it's almost like I've heard military strategists saying equate it to a missile. It's kind of like a missile because it hits, it can be directed. Yeah. But there's also multi-role. You're talking about the mother
drone,
mother drones. There's drones that are used primarily for forward observing, for drawing reconnaissance, for calling in a forward observer. Basically, is somebody who calls in artillery strikes. They use them for that. We're also now even starting to see ground-based drones and things like that. That's a work in progress. It's my understanding.
I've seen those. Those UGVs are now they're being developed with fiber optics as well, because they're very similar to the drone jammers. And we saw some UGVs, massive ones that look like mini tanks, that are being tested north of Kyiv last week as well. And they are fascinating because they were used before for demining and for reconnaissance, but they're being developed so that you can put machine guns on top of them.
Yeah. An M2 50 caliber Browning or a 20 millimeter cannon, and that's just crazy to me.
Yeah, and
the technology obviously is advancing. The capacity, the capability of what they're doing. But let's talk about the tactics. So, how do Ukrainians use their drones, and how do Russians use their drones? And is it common, or do they have distinctly different tactical usage?
Well, obviously, there's places like Kherson and Zaporizhia where they're just used indiscriminately to kill civilians.
Terrorize civilians, whether or not it's, as we've already spoken about, training. I've also heard that they're using it to try and evacuate the city, to make it so terrorized that people leave the city.
Typical Russian tactic is terror.
Tactics.
Ukrainians are definitely not doing that. So the main difference is frequencies, actually. The drones themselves are very, very similar. Both sides are using similar tech, because the second a drone crashes at your side of the front line, it gets taken to a lab and investigated straight away and developed, and they know what you're using and they're using, and they figure it out, and they have similar systems. Yeah. So the main thing is frequencies and who can jam what. But the biggest difference is the Russians have started using fiber optic drones in the Kursk region, but they're now being used in many other regions. This is a drone that looks exactly like this, but has a huge coil at the bottom of it, about this big, like a massive barrel, that can carry up to 20 kilometers of fiber optic cable, and it cannot be stopped. That is the biggest difference right now, and Russia got there first.
Because you can't break the signal.
Yeah, there's a signal between this drone and me as a controller. I've looked at lots of drone jammers, and I've seen how they work and the different frequencies, and it's very easy to jam a drone and to have it drop out of the sky or to take over control of it. But
and this is a video where you talk about that, so we'll show a little bit.
I have been tripping over this stuff, fiber optic cable, in this field in Ukraine for the last 30 minutes. You can't walk more than 10 seconds without it getting tangled up in your shoes and nearly falling over. And that is because this field is being used to fly the new fiber optic drones that the Ukrainians have been working with. It's so interesting. I'm here shooting for the last day of my drone documentary, and it's about the future. It's about where drones are going in the future.
This is the fiber optic, and so this trails behind a UAV, something that is flying.
Yeah.
But it's tethered to this fiber optic cable.
Yeah.
So it can't be jammed, and the signal is always returning to the operator. But the first question I'm going to ask is, how far can you fly one of these things? Because if you're restricted by how much fiber optic cable you've got.
Right. Well, this is what the cat and mouse chase is. It was 5 kilometers about 2 months ago when this was first used in Kursk. Now they're getting them up to 20 kilometers. And the ones that I've seen, the coils are huge. There's one in this video, actually, can carry about, I think it's 15 But there it is. Yeah. So go back a little bit, and
Okay.
so here, yeah, and then just press
Yeah,
play.
there's a jammer.
That's
So
a
that's your
jammer.
traditional jammer.
And
But
so
that's
these are the coils. So this is a nice diagram. You can see how big they are compared to the drone. They're light. But
Oh,
they're
okay.
huge.
So those drums there,
They're
those
full
are the
of coil.
coils.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I see. So it spools out, and you could. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. And what I've found super. So you can see in the bottom left here. That's how it looks when it's strapped. I was standing. In
Oh, so the fiber optic is on the drone itself.
Yeah.
Okay, I was thinking the fiber optic was going out from the operator, but it's actually
It's on the drone.
It's on the drone. Okay.
And I was always confused why it wouldn't pull the drone or sort of knock it over, but it almost falls out. It's so light the way that the system is inside. I think there's something inside of it that actually uncoils it, and it just falls, and it doesn't tug the controller at all. It's so interesting. But I remember standing in this field, and every 2 seconds I was tripping over this fiber optic cable, which is a environmental hazard as well. It's a disaster.
Boy, yeah.
It was crazy. Every 2 seconds I was tripping over this stuff, because in the future we're going to look at places where battles happened, because there'll be fields filled with fiber optic cable, not holes like in World War II, those battle holes that we see. It'll be like fields which were full of these sort of wires, and it's really, really unusual. But yeah, I mean, I was tripping over this stuff constantly. I've got loads of it at home, but it's an absolute nightmare. and
they swarm them as well, don't they? I mean,
drone swarms are extremely terrifying.
Yeah,
that is the next phase of this war.
I've heard a lot about that from Ukrainians in particular. I don't speak to a lot of Russian soldiers, but I do hear from my contacts in Ukrainian armed forces that there's something about the swarm aspect of these things.
There's a Black Mirror episode called Hated in the Nation that is the only thing I can think of that's similar to this. The drone swarms, when they start really taking off, are going to shake the world. I mean, this is what's really terrifying. This is where you can take off maybe 1,000 drones at the same time, overwhelm air defense systems, overwhelm any sort of jamming systems, and psychologically terrifying. And you could crash them into multiple targets at once. I've done a couple of interviews with drone experts recently as well that have said, in the future, you could fly a mothership over a city and have 2,000 or 3,000 drones drop from that mothership and take out targets using AI all at once. You could take out an entire city's infrastructure, its command, its police, all at once. This is actually possible, and we'll probably see something like this in 2025, 2026, all starting in Ukraine.
Well, of course, recently there's been this incident off the east coast of the United States where everybody's kind of freaking out about all these lights in the sky and these drones in the sky, which is, this is the future.
Yeah.
This is the way things are going to go one way or the other. And what I do think is whenever this war ends, one of the many contributions that the Ukrainian armed forces are going to give to the West is their understanding of how to use these things. So, sadly, like so many different wars, this is almost like a testing field for these new technologies. And
the Western countries are going to flock to Ukraine once this war is over to figure, because with military technology, it's not just about development, it's about how they're used in the battlefield, how they're actually physically used. And the information that Americans and British are getting from this stuff actually being used here is invaluable. And the future drone pilots of the world will probably all be trained in Ukraine. And it's crazy. I was thinking about it because I spent so much time in Kramatorsk and places recently with drone units embedded, where we were filming them literally crash them into their targets. And a lot of them were addicted to video games when they were growing up. And they're good at it because they have that reflex. And I was always sort of thinking, all the parents and all the sort of older people that were saying it's terrible to play video games, you shouldn't be doing it, are now, they're now like the most elite soldiers.
Nation, right? Yeah. And there's another weird thing about it as well, is that I remember there's a famous story of a grandmother, but I personally was at a location just outside of Kiev where it was a training ground, and I walked up, and there were grandmothers and stuff sitting there because they're not able to go to the front, but they're sure as heck able to put on a pair of goggles. And the learning curve for the older generations might be harder, but they can contribute directly to the war effort.
Yeah.
Which it's there's the old saying about the who was it, the 6-shooter, the revolver, the Colt revolver, that it was the great equalizer, that because anybody could pick it up and suddenly you had a lethal weapon.
Yeah.
Well, now it's whether you're a 17-year-old gamer or you're a 50-year-old grandmother, you slap on some goggles, you learn how to, use the controller, and off you go.
It's wild. And
it's wild, yeah.
When I was with a unit that were training before they go back to the front, these were all guys who were fighting with artillery in Bakhmut, and they all said that they'd had a career change, and they were all learning to fly FPVs, because they were like, anyone who is on the front line is now being retrained basically to fly these things, people that were in artillery. And that's happening so fast.
And also, in addition to that, you've got mass production coming out where it's also, I've heard stories, and I don't know if you've heard these as well, or can corroborate, that, when the war started, a lot of people would gather together and make like camouflage netting.
Yeah.
There is now a cottage industry. I call it a cottage industry, but it's people getting together, putting these things together as a part of the war effort. It's no longer like stitching socks or making camouflage netting that the community gets together to do. I've even heard of things like them setting up like assembly tables so that you can slot these things in together and process them through, and they're just churning them out because, as you well know, this country is mobilized. This entire country is mobilized.
Yeah, I mean,
everybody's trying to contribute. So you've got kids, at home putting these together, families putting these things together, and they're just churning them out. So to think that Ukraine doesn't have agency, and that if America, obviously, if Trump decides to pull support, it's going to be bad news. But there's growing domestic capability and agency here, and these things are a big part of it.
And this is 100% all made in Ukraine.
There you go.
It's 3D printed. I mean, that's another thing that I thought was fascinating. On every soldier's unit based along the front, they had 3D printers that were constantly making that noise where they're going back and forth every single time. It was really fascinating. But all of these parts are made in Ukraine. And I drove all the way from Chernobyl to Poltava and then all the way through Pokrovsk and up, and went to 10 or 20 warehouses that were secret locations disguised as certain things, where they were mass producing these things. And it was just a room full of 3D printers and volunteers, local people of all ages that were contributing parts, that were fixing it, putting things together. Was absolutely inspiring. It's why Ukraine will probably win this war.
Yeah, well, no, they know what they're fighting for. So, and as I say, they are mobilized.
Yeah.
What's been? You have a really good a documentary you've already done about Kherson. What did you call it? Remind me the title.
Hunted in Kherson.
Hunted in Kherson, which I recommend. Go check it out. I'll put the links, obviously, but it's a good one. You're working on the next one. We'll talk about that in a second. But I want to ask you, in your travels, what have you seen along the front lines? Specifically, obviously, when it comes to drones, but like, how are the soldiers? How's the morale? How are things out there?
The situation is very difficult. Certain parts of the Eastern Front right now. We were in Pokrovsk. Obviously, we were going towards Kharkov when this drone hit, and it's volatile. The front line, Russia's throwing everything they have at this right now in those regions, everything, because they want to show the world that maybe they can win this war, and they want to get it all done before Trump is elected, because they're worried that he could freeze the front line. The morale is good in certain areas, but it's terrible in other areas, because the Russians are happy to dispense of up to 2,000 soldiers a day in those areas. It's loud in those areas. You can hear. We have a drone detector that sits at the front of our car. At one point, it was detecting 10 drones all at once, all within a 10-kilometer radius of the car. And 2 people in the documentary that I'm premiering next week, 2 soldiers, have already died.
Yeah.
which are in the film. And this is
And these vehicles also, aside from the monitor, because you're trying to get different signals. Some of these cars look like porcupines. They've got so many different antennae sticking out to get those. But of course, as you mentioned, with the advent of the fiber optics, that may not be the case.
No, it's not the case so much. I mean, actually, the unit that we first met near Pokrovsk was in such a desperate situation. We gave them our jammers from our car, and then drove west a bit. Yeah, well, it's things are donated by volunteers to a lot of these units, and I think it's quite unusual. I don't think people quite understand that a lot of units have to get their own stuff in Ukraine, just because of the way that finances are allocated. And so I was going with Harry EST, who delivers drones by hand to the front. You don't want to post them there because there could be some corruption on the way. With no post, we don't know what's going on there, but he wants to make sure that they get those drones delivered to them by hand. And the look on the soldiers' faces when we hand over that stuff is shocking. They look like they've just been given something that will save their lives. Extremely grateful, but it shows the severity of the situation. I mean, the soldiers are desperate for jammers and desperate for drones. I didn't see any use of fiber optic drones, but my last night in Sumy, one of the local soldiers said that they could take me into Suja, into Russia, which obviously I said yes. I'd never been to Russia, but I thought it would make a nice trip.
Yeah, and this is inside Kursk, the Kursk Oblast.
Yeah, and this is when the counteroffensive had started and the North Koreans had been deployed. So volatile situation. He said that no young men had really been seen in Suja or any of those towns within the last 2 months of them occupying that area because they'd been sort of hiding from the military or they were sort of sleeper cells, maybe. And now they've all been spotted in the streets, and it became very, very, very volatile. So we went in there. Within about 30 seconds of crossing the border checkpoint, 2 Ukrainian tanks on fire sped straight past us, going from Suja, that had obviously just been hit by FPVs.
Right.
At which point I said that we should turn the car around and go back to Ukraine because I was like, that is not something I want to. I don't want to go down the road where there's cars on fire coming this way. But they said, well, if they've already been hit by FPVs, following them would be a disaster because there's probably 3 or 4 more heading their way. They're being chased, which kind of gives you the idea of what it feels like. Entire road was littered with cars that had been blown up by FPVs along the side of the roads. Went into Suja, went into an abandoned shopping center, spoke to Russians who were looting their own stores, which was pretty wild. And yeah, I mean, that was completely unbelievable. I think the Ukrainians have put their most elite forces into that region.
Into Kursk.
Yeah. And so I was in good hands. But it was really volatile.
Have you already published that material, or is that going to be part of your upcoming?
That's part of the next week's film. That's not come out yet.
So you are going to be putting out a new documentary, a new film outlining this trip that you took, the trip into Kursk. Is it still going to kind of focus primarily on drones?
Yeah, I was in 2 minds about whether even including Kursk in it because it's not really about drones, but it's interesting. So I'm putting it at the end. It's called Hunted from Above, and it's a follow-up to Hunted in Kherson. So in Kherson, basically the second that drone was hovering above me, I became obsessed with figuring out how these things work and what they do.
Understandably.
And so I traveled 2,000 kilometers from Chernobyl to Poltava to Pokrovsk to find out exactly not just how they're built, but how they're deployed and how they crash. It follows the entire process through secret warehouses of where they're stored and made. I even film in a very secret location where they're making napalm and thermite, the exact unit that was used in that Dragon's Teeth video.
The Dragon's Teeth stuff,
which was really interesting, and they were, using that night. So it's really extensive. It covers everything. But the speed that these things are being developed. 1 month ago, when I started filming this, it's already a different situation. So each week, I've been adding new information.
Well,
it's crazy.
I don't want to underestimate the enemy. And the Russians do have, once they get around to being adaptive, they can be adaptive. They can change their techniques. They're, don't underestimate them.
No, they
have.
But
compared to the Ukrainians, it's my impression, having been here throughout this entire war, full-scale war, that they are far more willing to kind of tweak things and workshop things.
Oh, yeah.
And
well, it's dynamic. Russia is
Exactly.
not dynamic in the
No,
culture.
it's
It's
not.
like, this is why this is a steel frame. It's actually really heavy, and it's kind of just pumped out in some rubbish factory. And then compare that to what the Ukrainians have done. It's actually a very
then give me this
visual
one.
symbol of the difference. And this can do 10
Oh,
times
yeah.
more.
No, this is a good. I don't know how many grams.
I haven't
more
weighed
than
it,
this,
but you can tell.
it's significant. There's a significant difference, and of course that would then affect your range. That would affect your battery capability, all the rest of it. Yeah, you're right. The Ukrainians are more dynamic at it, and they're more inventive.
Yes.
And have always been so throughout their history.
Yeah.
So look, I'm very much looking forward to Hunt It From Above.
That's it.
Okay, I'll be adding a link for your premiere. Will it be? You're going to premiere it here in Kiev?
Yeah, I'm going to premiere it at a cinema in Podil.
Down in Podil, good old Podil. But then you're going to make it available online, surely.
Yeah, so there's two things. So Hunted in Kherson was bought by Journeyman Pictures. So that they are basic. So I'm going to put out a 45-minute cut for free on YouTube and on X next week, publicly available. But Journeyman are interested in a 52-minute version that then they want to pitch to networks and broadcasters. So
Streaming
you'll see
services.
it straight away, but a few months later you might see it on TV.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we're all looking forward to that, and I'm glad we were able to talk about the nuts and bolts of the drone stuff. But there's another topic I'd like to talk to you about, and that is your efforts to, as we do here at On the Edge, and so many other vloggers out there here in Ukraine do. A big part of what you do is countering disinformation.
Yeah.
And you've been very present out there. And you've had pushback. You've had haters. You've had death threats. You've had all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What's it been like for you to be putting yourself out there as, in essence, someone working in the information warfare?
It's been unusual because I've spent
landscape.
I've spent the last 4 years making documentaries behind the camera for Byline, for John, for everybody. And it's my first time really being on camera and putting myself out there like that. I did that because I know what I'm talking about now. I've really spent time studying Ukraine for the last year, figuring out how things are working and putting all this
And it's
together.
different when you live here. It's just you sadly, the Western press flies in and flies out. It's another thing completely to live amongst the Ukrainian people.
I'm finding it actually quite exhausting,
Me
but I don't
too.
want to complain about it because Ukrainians, this is their home,
Yeah,
and
but
this
it
is what they've been
exhausting.
living
Of course,
through.
it's exhausting.
Really tired, actually, and I don't know what it is specifically that's so exhausting, but I feel like I'm aging years living here. I know I live in a nice apartment on a good street. I love Kyiv; it's beautiful, but
Yeah.
doing this work, the pushbacks from the Russians, I was on all of these Telegram channels after
Well,
I
my
went
beard
to...
is gray, not for, there's a reason.
Yeah.
War takes a lot out of you.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna go to Syria next week. So it's not really a break. But I feel like I hope I can just adjust because I want to be in Ukraine until this war is over, until this country is rebuilt, and film the entire process, film everything that happens, document everything.
That's why I'm here. Yeah.
But I'm not going to go home until that's done, back to Ireland. So no, I'm really tired, actually.
No, I get it. I get it. And it's exhausting. And mental health is a very serious issue. So as a veteran journalist to a younger journalist, take care of yourself that way. Always be conscious of your mental health. It's you're no good to anybody if you break. I've had colleagues throughout my entire career who push themselves past the breaking point, and then they are whether it's they fall into a bottle or whether they withdraw into some very dark psychological issues. It's very important to step outside. And
no, you're right.
So do be aware of that. But you're doing great work, and it's important. But again, going back to the kind of information war. Do you find yourself having been targeted by Russian bots or Russian guys? I mean, there's one instance I wanted to bring up with you was with this guy Nick Shirley.
Yeah, gosh.
Not that I want to give him any more attention. But an American guy comes over here, is very much an agitator,
Egregious.
and tries to comes to Kiev and goes around and points out like, oh, people are living normally. They're even like rich and benefiting. These are your tax dollars, kind of thing. And you brought him, you took him to task on that.
Yeah, because I know what he is, because I used to be like that for a short period. I know exactly what that is. I said that to him. I said, I know exactly what you're doing, and you should stop now. But what he did was he brought those tactics, that sort of agitator, rebel media, right-wing type tactics, to a country at war, to its capital. And I'd never seen anything like that before. It's beyond anything I'd ever participated in terms of how extreme it was. And there was rightful outrage about that. I mean, it was disgraceful. And he was and then so after that happened, I found his fixer. I found out everything out about him. I found out, his entire itinerary. And I saw that he'd gone to Bucha and he'd been shown the site of mass graves. He had been shown the children's hospital that was blown up, and decided to put that out instead. And that's why I just wrote this off and I said no. But no one was confronting him. And I think people need to confront propagandists, and people need to confront people like this.
I agree. I mean, just look at Tenet Media with, Tim Pool and all the rest.
Yep.
There is an information war going on, and it is manipulating people, particularly in the United States, because of course there's the MAGA movement, there's the Trump movement, which has this kind of anti-Ukrainian thing because of lots of different reasons that we don't go in.
There's the Russian front line here, and there's the front line online, which is
online, which is going to determine whether or not Ukraine gets the support it so desperately needs. So one way we can combat it is keep being out there, putting out information, putting out content that will counter Russia's narrative. And I think that's maybe not as important as the kinetic front line, but it's the battle of your minds, folks. It's very real, and it's good to see you putting stuff out, and I appreciate that. We'll keep doing what we're doing here, and I appreciate you having come in today. Is there anything else you want to add before we kind of draw this to a close? I mean, we'll be looking for Hunted from Above. The link will be included in this, and the premiere. Hopefully next Sunday.
It will be. Well, I've got to get it out before I go to Syria. That's like that cannot happen.
There is that as well. So yeah. But anything else you want to touch on before we draw it to a close? I mean,
I think you've covered everything.
Audience?
I think you've been pretty extensive asking all the questions. I think I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, keep it up. Keep safe. Syria is a tricky place. I've been to Syria before, not in these conditions, but Syria is a tricky place. But then, additionally, when you get back here, and do try and get away for just a little bit to recharge your batteries. I find myself having to do it, and then we're going to be, things are going to be tough here. 2025 is going to be a tough year. So hang in there. Thanks for what you're doing, and Caolan, it's been great talking to you. So
you too.
Everybody, please do go check out Caolan Robertson's content. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
All right.